In the autumn of 1878, the Duke of Ashworth attended exactly one social event. He didn't want to go. His mother made him. And in a small side room, away from the champagne and the candlelight, and every eligible woman his mother had mentally catalogued that evening, he heard something that changed everything. A violin, and the woman playing it didn't even look up when he walked in. This is the story of Edmund Ashworth, his mother Margaret, and a musician named Rose Calloway. It's a story about class and control, and what happens when a woman who has spent 30 years building walls around her son finally meets someone she cannot keep out. But we need to start earlier, because to understand Edmund, you have to understand what it costs a boy to grow up as the only man in a house full of grief. Edmund Ashworth was 7 years old when his father died. Not dramatically, not on a battlefield or in some grand scandal. Robert Ashworth, the 5th Duke of Ashworth, caught a fever in February and was dead by March. There was no warning, no long goodbye. One week, Edmund had a father who ruffled his hair at breakfast. The next week, the house was full of people dressed in black, speaking in low voices, and no one was ruffling anyone's hair anymore. He was the Duke now. That's what they told him. 7 years old, and he was the Duke. What does that mean to a 7-year-old boy? It means you watch grown men bow their heads slightly when they address you. It means your mother's hand on your shoulder gets a little tighter in public and a little more desperate in private. It means you learn very quickly that the people around you need you to be something, steady, composed, worthy of the name, before you've even learned what you yourself actually are. There was no uncle who stepped in, no grandfather still living, no older brother. Edmund was it, the last Ashworth male. And the weight of that, invisible, unspoken, constant, shaped every single thing about him. He became a people pleaser because disappointing anyone felt dangerous. He became quiet because quiet men don't make mistakes. He became, by the time he was in his 20s, extraordinarily good at being in a room without really being there, present in body, elsewhere in every other sense. And his mother, Margaret, the Dowager Duchess, she did what she believed was right. She held everything together. She ran the estate, managed the finances, kept the name respectable. She loved Edmund fiercely, in the way that fear sometimes disguises itself as love. She didn't want him to fail. She didn't want him to get hurt. She didn't want him to make the kind of choices that couldn't be undone. So she made them for him. Quietly, persistently, for 25 years. By 1878, Edmund Ashworth was 32 years old and had never once, in his adult life, made a significant decision without first checking, consciously or not, whether his mother would approve. Now, Margaret. I want to be careful here, because Margaret Ashworth is very easy to dislike, and if we dislike her too quickly, we miss the most interesting thing about her. She was not a cruel woman. She was not calculating in the way of a villain. She was a woman who had learned, very young, that the world was not safe for people who made sentimental decisions, and she had spent the rest of her life making sure no one she loved would have to learn that the hard way. She had a list, an actual list. Whether it existed on paper or just in her mind depends on who you ask, but the contents were consistent. The right families, the right bloodlines, the right kind of girl for Edmund. Someone who understood what the Ashworth name required. Someone who would fit. She'd been refining this list for years. So in October of 1878, when Lord and Lady Pembridge announced their autumn ball, the kind of event where half of London's respectable society would appear, daughters prominently displayed, Margaret saw an opportunity. Getting Edmund to agree was another matter. "You haven't been out in weeks," she said at breakfast, in the tone she used when she was presenting a statement, as if it were merely an observation. Edmund looked up from his newspaper. "I've been perfectly occupied." Occupied. She repeated the word the way you repeat a word when you find it inadequate. "Edmund, the Pembridges have invited half the county. Lord Ashworth cannot simply, 'I'll think about it.' He said that a lot. 'I'll think about it.' It was his way of ending a conversation without technically losing it. But Margaret had 32 years of practice. By Thursday evening, Edmund was dressed, in the carriage, on his way to the Pembridge ball. He wasn't sure exactly how it had happened. It had happened the way weather happens, gradually, and then all at once. Margaret watched the carriage leave from the upstairs window. Please, she thought, not to God exactly, just to the general direction of fate. Let something good come of this evening. She was picturing a debutante, someone from a good family, perhaps a little shy, well-mannered, someone suitable. She was not picturing what actually happened, but then no one ever is. No, the Pembridge ball was everything Edmund had expected, and nothing he could tolerate for more than 40 minutes. It wasn't that the people were unkind. They were perfectly pleasant. They said perfectly pleasant things in perfectly modulated voices, and laughed at the right moments, and asked after his health and his estate, with the precise level of interest that society demanded. And Edmund smiled, and responded, and refilled his glass, and smiled again, and felt absolutely nothing. This was the particular loneliness of being Edmund Ashworth. Not that he was unloved. He wasn't. Not that he was isolated. He was surrounded. But there was a specific kind of exhaustion that came from spending an evening performing warmth you didn't feel, in rooms where every conversation had an agenda barely concealed beneath the surface. He knew what these people saw when they looked at him. A title, an estate, a very eligible match. No one asked him what he actually thought about anything. Around 10:15, he excused himself from a conversation about hunting, a subject he found almost comically uninteresting, and slipped through a side door. The corridor was cooler, quieter. He followed it without particular intention, just away from the noise, past a row of portraits of Pembridge ancestors, looking variously stern and confused, and through a half-open door at the far end. It was a music room, small, underlit compared to the ballroom, smelling faintly of candle wax and old wood. There were chairs stacked against one wall, a piano, lid down, and near the window, standing with her back half turned to the door, a young woman with a violin tucked under her chin. She was playing something he didn't recognize. Not one of the formal pieces the orchestra had been cycling through all evening. Something else. Slower. A little irregular, like she was working something out rather than performing it. Edmund stopped in the doorway. She knew he was there. He could tell because there was a slight adjustment, not in the music, which continued, but in the set of her shoulders. The kind of adjustment that says, "I am aware of you, and I have decided to continue anyway." He found a chair, sat down. She played for perhaps another 3 minutes. Then she lowered the bow, turned slightly, and looked at him with an expression that was not unfriendly, but was also not particularly impressed. "The ball is that direction," she said, tilting her head toward the corridor. "I'm aware," said Edmund. A pause. "I'm on my break," she said, clarifying her position, in case he'd missed it. "I work here. This isn't my party." "I know," he said. "I heard you from the corridor. I thought—" He stopped. He'd been about to say, "I thought it was the most interesting sound in the building," which was true, but which also sounded like something a man says when he's trying to make an impression. He wasn't trying to make an impression. He just didn't want to go back. "I wondered," he tried again, if you might continue." She looked at him for a moment, the look of someone trying to determine whether a request is sincere or performative. Then she raised the violin again. She played for another 10 minutes. Edmund didn't move. When she finished the second time, she began packing her instrument with the efficient movements of someone who had done it 1,000 times. Edmund understood that this was his signal. "Thank you," he said, standing. "Good night," she said. Not unkindly, just, "This is where our interaction ends." He walked back toward the ballroom. His mother intercepted him near the entrance, her eyes bright with the particular energy of someone who has spent an hour surveilling a room. "There you are. I want to introduce you to the Hartley girls. The eldest is quite—" "Of course," said Edmund. He smiled. He was introduced. He said the right things. But his mind was still in that side room, with the irregular music and the woman who hadn't stopped playing when he walked in. He didn't tell his mother about the musician. Not that evening, not in the days that followed. He wasn't sure why exactly. Perhaps because there was nothing to tell. He'd sat in a room and listened to someone play, and she'd told him good night, and that was the end of it. Except it didn't feel like the end of it. He found out her name 3 days later. Rose Calloway. He asked the Pembridge's event coordinator, casually, as if it were a passing curiosity. He was given a name and a street, offered with the mild bemusement of someone who had never before been asked this particular question by someone of Edmund's standing. He stood on her street on a Tuesday morning, the Duke of Ashworth, outside a terraced house in the unfashionable part of the city, and knocked on the door. Rose Calloway answered it. She looked at him, then at the street behind him, as if confirming there was no carriage, no entourage, no reasonable explanation for this. "I'd like to hear you play again," Edmund said. A long pause. "My public concerts," said Rose, "are advertised in the Thursday paper. You're welcome to purchase a ticket." She closed the door. Edmund stood on the step for a moment. Then he went home, found the Thursday paper, located the advertisement, and bought a ticket. Margaret noticed he was going out that evening. She noticed the particular way he dressed, not for a formal occasion, but with a kind of intention she hadn't seen before. Maybe someone caught his eye. At the Pembridge ball, she thought. Finally. She had no idea she was right. Before we go any further, we need to talk about Rose Calloway, because it would be very easy in a story like this to let Rose exist only in relation to Edmund, the woman who changed him, the woman Margaret opposed, the woman at the center of the conflict. But Rose had a whole life before Edmund Ashworth knocked on her door, and if you don't understand that life, you won't understand why she kept closing it on him. Rose was 26 years old in 1878. She'd grown up in the kind of household where money was not a crisis, but was always a conversation. Her father a music teacher, her mother taking in sewing work during the lean months, both of them people who believed deeply in doing things properly, and never quite had the resources to do them lavishly. It was a warm house, a real house, in the way that some houses are real, and some are just well decorated. Her father had taught her violin from the age of 5, not because he thought she'd be a prodigy, though she was good, genuinely good, but because he believed music was one of the few things the world couldn't take from you once you had it. You could lose a job, lose a house, lose a great many things. But if you could play, you always had something. She'd taken that seriously. By her mid-20s, she was working regularly. Balls, private concerts, the occasional church event. It was not glamorous work. It was work. You arrived early, you set up, you played what was requested, you were paid, you left. The people who hired you were rarely unkind, but they were also, with very few exceptions, not particularly interested in you as a person. You were a service. A pleasant one, but a service. Rose had made a kind of peace with this. She wasn't bitter about it. Bitterness requires a sense that things should have been otherwise, and Rose was too practical for that. But she was clear-eyed. She knew exactly how these rooms worked. She knew the difference between someone who genuinely heard the music and someone who wanted the music as decoration. She knew when she was being seen and when she was being looked through. Which is why, at the Pembridge Ball, when a man in an expensive coat walked into the room where she was playing her break piece, the one she played for herself, not for anyone else, and simply sat down and listened, she noticed. She noticed because he didn't say anything. He didn't compliment her immediately, which was what people usually did when they wandered in. A reflex, like saying, "Bless you," after a sneeze. He just sat and listened, with the kind of attention that's actually quite rare and therefore quite recognizable. She still gave him nothing. She had learned, in 26 years, that giving things to people in expensive coats on the basis of one good impression was a reliable way to be disappointed. But she noticed. The Thursday concert was in a small hall near the river, 40 seats maybe, half of them filled, which was a decent turnout for the kind of event that didn't advertise itself aggressively and relied on a loyal, if modest, audience. Rose played 3 pieces in the first half. Standard program. 1 Vivaldi, 1 piece by a composer most of the audience wouldn't recognize, but which Rose loved, and a folk melody she'd arranged herself. She knew this repertoire the way you know a route you've walked 100 times. Her hands knew it. Her body knew it. Her mind was elsewhere, which for Rose meant she was playing better than usual, not worse. She didn't look for him specifically when she walked out. That would have required admitting she'd wondered whether he'd come. But she found him. 3rd row from the back, on the left. Alone. No companion. No companion he was pretending not to have brought. Just a man in a good coat, sitting in a 40-seat hall near the river on a Thursday evening, holding a program he didn't appear to be reading. She played the Vivaldi. At the interval, she stayed backstage. She had learned that going out during the interval created conversations she didn't always have the energy for. She drank tea from a small cup and listened to the muffled sounds of the audience through the door. He didn't come backstage, which she'd half expected. It's what people who wanted something from her usually did, used the interval as an opportunity to introduce themselves properly, to say something about her playing that was designed to open a door. He didn't. She played the second half. He stayed for all of it. She could tell without looking directly. There was a quality to an audience when everyone was still, and she had developed, over years, a sensitivity to disruption. He didn't disrupt anything. At the end, he applauded, stood up, and left. Rose packed her violin in the case that had belonged to her father, clicked the clasps shut, and stood there for a moment in the empty hall. She thought, well, that was all. Just, well. But she thought it twice. He came back to her street the following week. Rose opened the door and looked at him with an expression that said, quite clearly, "You again." "I wanted to say," Edmund began, "that the second piece in the first half, the one I didn't recognize." "Foray," said Rose. "Most people don't recognize it." "It was remarkable." "Thank you." A pause. He was standing on her doorstep with no particular plan, which Rose could tell because people with plans have a different energy. They arrive with the energy of someone about to say something. He'd arrived with the energy of someone who'd simply needed to go somewhere and had chosen here. It was, despite herself, slightly disarming. "Do you always attend concerts alone?" she asked. She wasn't sure why she asked it. Curiosity, maybe, or the beginning of a theory she was testing. Edmund considered this. "I find," he said, "that when you bring someone, you spend the evening managing their experience of it. Whether they're enjoying themselves, whether they need another drink. You're not really listening anymore. Rose looked at him. "That's a very specific thing to have worked out," she said. "I've had a lot of concerts to work it out in." She almost smiled. She stopped herself. "I have a lesson in 20 minutes, she said. "Of course." He didn't move immediately, though, just stood there for a moment, in the way of someone who has more to say and has decided not to say it yet. "The program for your next concert, is it the same repertoire?" "Mostly. I'm adding something at the end." "I'll look for the advertisement," he said. He left. Rose closed the door, leaned against it for approximately 2 seconds, and then went to prepare for her lesson. She told herself this was simply an unusual patron. She almost believed it. Back at Ashworth House, Margaret was constructing a theory. Edmund was going out, regularly, with a kind of quiet purpose she hadn't seen in him before. He was dressing carefully but not formally, not the way you dress for dinners and obligations, but the way you dress when you care how you appear to one specific person. He was reading in the evenings, which he'd always done, but now sometimes he'd stop and stare at the page for a while without really reading it. She knew these signs. She'd been watching Edmund for 32 years. She also knew that he wasn't telling her anything, which meant he'd correctly predicted she would have opinions. She told herself this was promising. He was clearly interested in someone. She ran through the possibilities from the Pembridge ball. The Hartley girl had seemed taken with him, and the younger Fairfax daughter had asked after him twice since the event, which was almost certainly deliberate. She allowed herself a cautious optimism. One evening, she asked very casually. She had perfected the art of the casual question. "You seem in better spirits lately." Edmund looked up. "Do I?" "You've been going out." "Yes." "Anyone I know?" A pause. "Just long enough to be noticeable." "No," Edmund said, and returned to his book. Margaret sat with that answer for several days. She told herself it meant nothing. People kept things private until they were certain. That was sensible. That was what she would have done. But there was something in that pause that she couldn't quite put down. She filed it away. She waited. She was very good at waiting. She had no idea she was waiting for the worst possible news. The invitation arrived at Rose's address on a Wednesday. Cream paper, good quality. Handwritten. Not by a secretary, she could tell by the slight inconsistency in the pressure of the pen, someone who didn't write formal invitations very often. "Dear Miss Calloway, I am hosting a small musical evening at Ashworth House on the 14th. If you are available and willing, I would be grateful for your participation. A fee has been arranged with your usual booking contact. E. Ashworth." Rose read it 3 times. The fee was generous. More than generous. It was the kind of fee that made an offer difficult to decline on practical grounds, which she suspected was intentional. She was not sure whether to find this thoughtful or irritating. She decided, provisionally, both. She accepted. The evening itself was small, perhaps 15 guests, scattered across 2 rooms, the kind of gathering that called itself informal, while still operating by every rule of formality, just slightly relaxed. Rose arrived early, as she always did, and was met by a housekeeper who showed her to the music room. Edmund appeared 20 minutes later. He looked, she thought, slightly nervous, not in a way that was visible to the room, but in the way that was visible to someone paying attention. "Thank you for coming," he said. "It's a booking," said Rose. "Thank you for the fee." "Of course." A pause. "How are you finding the instrument? The acoustics in this room? I wasn't certain." "It's a good room," she said. And it was. High ceiling, wooden floors, the kind of space that treated sound respectfully. Whoever chose it knew what they were doing. "I measured it," said Edmund, slightly awkwardly. There are apparently ways to estimate acoustic quality before." He stopped. "It doesn't matter. I'm glad it works." Rose looked at him. A born who measured a room's acoustics before inviting a musician to play in it. She filed this information away without comment and began her warm-up. The evening went well. She played for an hour, 2 short breaks. The guests murmured appreciatively. Margaret circulated, the perfect hostess, attentive and gracious. Rose watched her from the corner of her eye, watched the way she moved through the room, watched the way she occasionally glanced toward Edmund, watched the way she noted who he spoke to. After the guests had gone, Edmund appeared in the doorway of the music room again. Rose was packing up. He sat in the same chair he'd sat in at the Pembridge ball, uninvited, and she found she didn't mind. "The piece you played at the end," he said, "the one you added. You remembered. You said you were adding something. I was listening for it." She looked at him properly then, not the glance she'd given him at the door, not the measured, sidelong attention she'd been paying him all evening. Actually looked. "My father wrote it," she said. "Technically, he never finished it. I finished it." "When did he die?" It was a direct question. Most people skirted it, said "I'm sorry for your loss," and moved efficiently past. He just asked. 4 years ago, she said. "Mine was when I was 7, said Edmund. "I barely remember what he sounded like. His voice, I mean." A silence settled between them. Not uncomfortable. The kind of silence that happens when 2 people have said something true at the same time and are both deciding what to do with it. "You measured the room," Rose said. "I did." "Why?" Edmund thought about this. "Because I wanted it to be right," he said. "For you, to play in." Rose put the violin in the case, clicked the clasps. "Good night, Your Grace," she said. But she said it differently than she had at the Pembridge ball. "Not this is where our interaction ends. More like, I need to think about this." She walked home through the cold evening air and thought about it the entire way. In the drawing room, Margaret poured herself a small glass of something and turned over the evening in her mind. The guests had been pleasant. The music had been lovely. Edmund had seemed almost alive, in a way that she found both gratifying and, for reasons she couldn't quite name, unsettling. She'd noticed him in the doorway of the music room after the guests left. She'd noticed who he was in the doorway for. She set down her glass. "No," she thought. "Absolutely not," and began, quietly, to make a plan. There is a particular kind of mother who loves her child so completely, so absolutely, that she can not tell the difference between protecting him and controlling him. Margaret Ashworth was that kind of mother. And by the morning after the musical evening, she had made a decision. This would end. Quietly, efficiently, and before it became something that couldn't be undone. She'd seen the way Edmund looked at that girl. She'd seen it, and she recognized it, because she had a memory she kept in a very locked place, a memory of being young and looking at someone the wrong way, and what it had cost her. She was not going to let Edmund make that mistake. The question was how. Margaret was not a dramatic woman. She didn't believe in scenes. Scenes were for people who had already lost control of a situation. She believed in quiet pressure, applied consistently, in the right places. Water on stone. Given enough time, water always wins. She started with Edmund. She chose her moment carefully. Sunday breakfast. Edmund was always slightly softer on Sunday mornings, less armored. The week hadn't started yet. She poured his tea herself, which she didn't always do, and sat down across from him, with the air of someone who had something on her mind and was deciding whether to say it. Edmund knew this performance well. He waited. "The musical evening was lovely," she said. "I'm glad you thought so." "The girl plays beautifully." Edmund looked up from his plate, carefully neutral. "She does. Very accomplished." A pause. Margaret turned her cup slightly on its saucer. It must be a difficult life, that kind of work. Moving from house to house, always someone else's occasion. She said it thoughtfully, as if she were genuinely reflecting on Rose's circumstances, as if she were sympathetic. One wonders if they ever feel, I don't know, at home, anywhere. Edmund said nothing. I only mention it, Margaret continued, because I noticed you speaking with her after the guests had gone, which is perfectly kind of you, of course. You were always considerate with staff. The word staff landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Edmund put down his fork. She wasn't staff, Mother. She was a hired musician. Of course, that's what I said. It wasn't what she'd said. They both knew it. Edmund picked up his fork again. A long silence. Margaret sipped her tea and waited, because she had 32 years of practice, and she knew that Edmund, when he was upset, went quiet before he went anywhere. I've been to her concerts, Edmund said. 3 of them. We have spoken on several occasions. Margaret looked at him with an expression of such careful, loving concern that it was almost impossible to argue with. Edmund, I'm not suggesting anything improper. I simply... She paused. You are the Duke of Ashworth. You understand what that means. The decisions you make are not only yours. They never have been. Edmund looked at his mother. She looked back at him with complete sincerity. He said, I'll think about it. He left the table early. Margaret remained, finished her tea, and noted, with the precision of someone keeping score, that he hadn't said she was wrong. While Margaret was applying pressure from one end, Rose was going about her life with the determined practicality that had always characterized her. She had 4 students that week, 2 children, 1 middle-aged banker who'd decided in a burst of ambition that he would learn the violin and was now discovering what that actually involved, and a teenage girl who was genuinely talented and knew it, which made her both a pleasure and an occasional headache to teach. She had 2 bookings, a dinner party on Thursday, a church concert on Saturday. She had, in the spaces between these things, a persistent and somewhat annoying awareness of Edmund Ashworth. Not romantic, she told herself. Analytical. He was an unusual person. She was simply trying to understand what made him unusual. This was a normal thing to do. She thought about the room he'd measured. She thought about the way he'd asked about her father, directly, without flinching, as if grief were a normal subject for conversation rather than something to be navigated around. She thought about the fact that he'd sat through 3 of her concerts without once trying to impress her with his knowledge of music, which was the thing that men who wanted to impress her with their knowledge of music always did. She thought, he's either genuinely good, or he's very good at appearing genuine. She thought, I'm not sure I know how to tell the difference. She thought, I should probably be more careful. She thought all of this while teaching the banker his scales, which he was murdering enthusiastically, and she kept her expression perfectly encouraging throughout, because that was her job, and Rose Calloway was good at her job. The invitation arrived on a Monday, Margaret's handwriting this time, different from Edmund's, more controlled, each letter placed with intention. Dear Miss Calloway, I would be very pleased if you would join me for tea on Wednesday at 3 o'clock. Margaret, Dowager Duchess of Ashworth. Rose read it and felt something cold move through her chest. She knew what this was. She'd grown up without illusions about how these things worked. A woman like Margaret Ashworth did not invite musicians to tea out of social warmth. This was not a friendly gesture. This was a conversation that had already been decided and simply needed to be delivered in person. She went anyway, because Rose Calloway did not, as a rule, avoid things. The drawing room at Ashworth House was immaculate. Not comfortable. Immaculate. Every surface placed, every arrangement considered. Margaret was already seated when Rose was shown in, which was a choice, because it meant Rose had to cross the room to her, rather than them meeting at the door. Small things. Deliberate things. "Miss Calloway," Margaret gestured to the chair across from her. "Thank you for coming. Please, sit." The tea was poured. There were small sandwiches, which neither of them ate. There was a brief, practiced exchange about the weather and the city that Rose understood to be the opening formality, and she matched it precisely, because she had not grown up in London without learning that every room has its own language. Then Margaret set down her cup with the slight finality of someone changing registers. "You're very talented," she said. "I hope that's clear. I have nothing but admiration for your playing." "Thank you," said Rose. "And I imagine you're an intelligent woman. You've built a life for yourself with real skill. That's not nothing in this city." "No," said Rose. "It isn't. So I'll speak plainly," said Margaret, "because I think you'd find anything else insulting." Rose waited. "My son is—" Margaret paused, choosing words. "Edmund is not a simple person to understand. He appears self-contained, and in some ways he is. But he lost his father at an age when boys need fathers most, and the result is that he has spent his adult life being steadier than he feels. He performs confidence he doesn't have. He is kind, and he is good, and he is not someone who should be." She stopped again. "He is not someone who can afford to want things he cannot have. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" The room was very quiet. Rose said, "You're telling me that he's become interested in me, and you'd like me to discourage it." "I'm telling you," Margaret said carefully, "that if you care about him at all, and I think you may, then you understand that there are realities neither of you can simply decide to ignore. His name, his position, what's expected. The world doesn't—" She paused. "The world doesn't change because two people feel something inconvenient." Rose looked at her hands for a moment. Then she looked up. "You're right that I'm intelligent," she said. "So you'll understand when I say, I know exactly what you're doing, and I know you believe you're doing it for him." Margaret held her gaze. "I'm not going to make you a promise," Rose said, "but I'll tell you this. I have never in my life tried to be something I'm not to impress someone. I'm not going to start." She stood, thanked Margaret for the tea, left. On the street outside, she walked for 20 minutes without any particular destination, because she needed the cold air and the movement, and the specific privacy of being a person among people who didn't know her. She was not going to cry. She was not going to cry. She didn't. But that evening, she wrote in the small notebook she kept. Not a diary, just a place for thoughts too specific to hold. A single line. "She's afraid of something. Not me. Something older." She closed the notebook. She didn't know yet what it meant, but she kept it. Edmund pulled back. Not completely. Not dramatically. He didn't write a letter. Didn't have a conversation. Didn't do anything that could be pointed to later as a decision. He simply stopped going out. Stopped attending her concerts. Sent no word. It was, in its way, the most Edmund thing he could have done. When caught between two things that both felt impossible, he went very still and waited to see if the situation would resolve without him. Rose noticed the absence. She didn't contact him. She had told Margaret she wouldn't make promises, and she had meant it. But she also had enough self-respect to know that she was not going to chase a man who had decided to disappear. She taught her students. She played her bookings. She was perfectly fine. She was not perfectly fine. Margaret, watching Edmund's withdrawal from her peripheral vision, felt something she identified as relief, and which was, if she'd examined it more carefully, actually something closer to guilt wearing relief's clothes. He was being sensible. He was making the right choice. She had done what needed to be done. She told herself this at breakfast. She told herself this at dinner. She told herself this in the small hours of the night, when the house was quiet, and the things you'd been out running all day finally caught up with you. 30 years ago, she thought, in those hours, someone sat across from me and told me that love was not enough. They were right, she told herself. They were right. She pulled the blanket up and waited for sleep, and told herself one more time that she had done what needed to be done. And 3 floors down, Edmund lay awake and stared at the ceiling, and felt, for the first time in his adult life, the specific and unmistakable anger of a man who has finally found something he wants and has allowed it to be taken from him, without a word. He lay with that anger for 4 days. On the 5th day, he got up, dressed, and went to find Rose. She was teaching when he knocked. He could hear, faintly through the door, the halting progress of someone learning something difficult. 2 notes, a pause. 2 notes again. The teacher's voice underneath it, patient and precise. He waited on the step. It was raining slightly. The fine, persistent rain that London does in November, that isn't quite enough to justify an umbrella, but is more than enough to make you thoroughly damp over time. He stood in it. 20 minutes later, the door opened, and a child came out with a violin case, glanced at him with complete indifference, and ran off down the street. Rose appeared in the doorway. She looked at him, at the rain, at him again. "You're wet," she said. "Yes. You've been standing there a while. 20 minutes, approximately." A pause. "You'd better come in," she said. Not warmly, not coldly. With the pragmatism of someone who was not going to leave another human being standing in the November rain, regardless of the complications involved. Her front room was small and warm and absolutely full of music. Not sound, but the evidence of it. Sheet music on every surface, a music stand in the corner, a second violin on a hook by the window, older than the one she performed with. Books, a cat, sleeping on a chair, who opened one eye at Edmund and then closed it again, having decided he was not interesting. Edmund stood in the middle of it and felt, suddenly and overwhelmingly, that he was in the most real room he'd been in years. "I owe you an explanation," he said. "You don't owe me anything," said Rose. "We're not. You don't owe me anything." "I know. I want to give you one anyway." He looked at her. "My mother spoke to you. It wasn't a question. Rose didn't treat it like one." "She did," she said. "She had no right to do that. She had every right. She's your mother, and she's trying to protect you. I didn't agree with her, but I understood her." Edmund was quiet for a moment. "I pulled away because I didn't know what else to do. I've spent my whole life not knowing what else to do when she—" He stopped, started again. "When I was 8 years old, I wanted a dog. My mother said the house wasn't suitable. I never asked again." A pause. "I'm 32 years old, and I still haven't asked again. About anything." Rose looked at him for a long time. "I'm asking now," Edmund said. "I'd like to see you, properly. I don't know what that looks like, and I understand if you'd rather not. I understand if this is all too complicated and not worth the— I understand." "You said I understand 3 times, Rose said. "I know. I was nervous." The cat shifted on the chair. The rain tapped at the window. Somewhere outside, a horse went past on the wet street. "There's tea," said Rose. "If you want some." Edmund looked at her. "Yes," he said. "Please." It was the smallest possible yes, the most provisional, the most careful. But Rose turned toward the kitchen, and Edmund sat down in the chair that wasn't occupied by the cat, and outside the November rain continued, and inside, something that had been paused began again. Margaret found out the way she found out most things, not from Edmund directly, but from the accumulated evidence of his behavior. He was going out again. He'd come home one evening with a small damp patch on his shoulder, the way you get when you've been somewhere that had a cat, and the cat made itself at home. She sat with this information. She had done everything correctly. She'd spoken to Edmund. She'd spoken to the girl. The girl had left, or so she'd assumed. Edmund had pulled back. She'd seen it herself. She'd thought it was over. It wasn't over. For the first time, Margaret felt something she wasn't accustomed to feeling. She felt outmaneuvered. Not by scheming. There had been no scheme. Just by two people who had separately decided that what they wanted mattered. She sat in her chair by the fire and felt old in a way that had nothing to do with age. And she thought about a boy she'd known once, 40 years ago. A boy who made her laugh, who was not suitable, whose unsuitability had been explained to her very clearly by her mother, in a room not so different from this one. She had been so certain at the time that she'd made the right decision. She had never, in 40 years, fully stopped wondering. The fire crackled. The house was quiet. Somewhere upstairs, Edmund was reading. Or not reading. Staring at the page, probably. Thinking about someone. Margaret closed her eyes. I know, she thought. I know exactly what that feels like. And for the first time since this had all begun, she didn't reach for a plan. Margaret found out the way she found out most things, not from Edmund directly, but from the accumulated evidence of his behavior. He was going out again. He'd come home one evening with a small damp patch on his shoulder, the way you get when you've been somewhere that had a cat, and the cat made itself at home. She sat with this information. She had done everything correctly. She'd spoken to Edmund. She'd spoken to the girl. The girl had left, or so she'd assumed. Edmund had pulled back. She'd seen it herself. She'd thought it was over. It wasn't over. For the first time, Margaret felt something she wasn't accustomed to feeling. She felt outmaneuvered. Not by scheming. There had been no scheme. Just by two people who had, separately, decided that what they wanted mattered. She sat in her chair by the fire and felt old in a way that had nothing to do with age. And she thought about a boy she'd known once, 40 years ago. A boy who made her laugh, who was not suitable, whose unsuitability had been explained to her very clearly by her mother, in a room not so different from this one. She had been so certain at the time that she'd made the right decision. She had never, in 40 years, fully stopped wondering. The fire crackled. The house was quiet. Somewhere upstairs, Edmund was reading. Or not reading. Staring at the page, probably. Thinking about someone. Margaret closed her eyes. I know, she thought. I know exactly what that feels like. And for the first time since this had all begun, she didn't reach for a plan. By the fourth day, she couldn't pretend anymore. It was a chest cold, serious enough to put her in bed, not serious enough to be alarming in itself. The doctor came, prescribed rest and warmth, and the various remedies that doctors prescribed in 1878, with the confidence of men who knew somewhat less than they appeared to. Edmund was away, a 2-day matter in the city relating to the estate, something about a lease agreement that needed his signature in person. He'd left on a Tuesday. He was due back Thursday. The housekeeper, Mrs. Beale, who had been at Ashworth House for 19 years and had developed a calm competence in all situations that Margaret deeply relied upon, sent word to Edmund. She also, after a moment's hesitation, sent word to Lady Haverford. Constance. The reply from Edmund came within hours. He would return as soon as the matter was resolved. Friday at the latest. He was sorry. Was there anything she needed? Margaret read this and felt the particular comfort of a son who loves you. The reply from Constance came 3 days later. A letter. Cream paper. Haverford stationery. Dear Mother, I was so sorry to hear you are unwell. William and I are unfortunately in the midst of our journey to Bath. We have had this planned for some months, as you may remember. I do hope you'll be feeling much better by the time you read this. The doctor will take good care of you. Do write when you're recovered. With love, Constance. Margaret read it once. She folded it once. She placed it on the bedside table. She did not unfold it again. She lay in the gray December light and listened to the house move around her. The creak of the floorboards, the distant sound of the kitchen, the particular quality of silence that a large house has when you are the only one in it who is still. She had not expected Constance to come. She realized this, lying there. She had hoped, but she had not, actually, expected. She wondered when she had stopped expecting. She heard the knock at the front door from upstairs. She heard Mrs. Beale's footsteps in the hall, the door opening, voices too low to make out. A pause, then footsteps on the stairs. Not Mrs. Beale's familiar tread, something lighter. A knock at her bedroom door. Come in, she said, because she was Margaret Ashworth, and she did not hide in her own bedroom. The door opened. Rose Calloway stood in the doorway. She was wearing her ordinary coat, not dressed up, not as if she'd made any particular effort, which somehow made it worse and better simultaneously. She was carrying something wrapped in cloth that turned out, when she set it on the small table by the window, to be a covered dish. Edmund wrote to me, she said simply. He said you were unwell and he couldn't get back until Friday. Margaret looked at her. I don't require, she began. I know, said Rose. I brought soup. Mrs. Beale can heat it. I don't need to stay. A pause. You came, Margaret said. Not warmly, not coldly, just noting the fact of it. Yes, said Rose. Constance didn't. She hadn't meant to say that. It came out before she could apply the usual filter, and once it was in the room, it couldn't be taken back. Rose absorbed it without expression. No, Rose said. I know. The room was quiet for a moment. Outside, the December wind moved against the windows. You can sit, Margaret said finally. The words cost her something. You could tell by the way she said them. Not gracious, not yet, but not nothing. If you've come all this way, you might as well sit. Rose sat. She came back the next day, and the day after. She didn't make a performance of it. She didn't arrive with elaborate gestures or lengthy conversation, or any of the things that would have required Margaret to respond with equivalent warmth, which Margaret was not ready to produce. She came. She checked on the household. She sat for a while. She left. The soup was good. Margaret noted this with the involuntary honesty of someone who had expected it not to be. On the third day, Margaret was sitting up in bed, feeling somewhat better, when Rose came in with tea and settled in the chair by the window and began reading. She'd brought a book, her own book. She wasn't waiting for Margaret to entertain her, just present, quietly present. Margaret watched her for a while. You're not what I expected, she said. Rose looked up from her book. What did you expect? Margaret considered this honestly, which was not her habit with people she'd decided to oppose. Someone more eager to please, she said. In your position, given the circumstances. Given that I'm not suitable, Rose said, directly, without heat. You did. You were right, by your definition. Rose closed her book, not dismissively, just marking her place. I know what I am. I know what he is. I'm not confused about it. Then why? Because he measured the room, Rose said. Margaret blinked. Before the musical evening, Rose said. He measured the acoustics of the room before inviting me to play in it. He wanted it to be right. For me. He didn't mention it to impress me. I found out from one of your staff by accident. He just did it, and didn't say anything about it. She paused. That's who he is. That's what I am. That's why. Margaret was silent for a long moment. He learned that from his father, she said finally. Her voice was quieter than it had been. Robert was like that. Quiet kindnesses. Things he did without needing them noticed. She stopped. Something had shifted in her face, not collapsed, but loosened. The way ice sounds before it moves. Edmund was so young when he died, she said. He doesn't remember it, but it's in him somewhere. Those things get in. Rose didn't say anything. She understood, with the instinct of someone who had learned when to speak and when to let silence do its work, that this was not a moment for a response. Margaret turned toward the window. He needs someone who sees that, she said. Not to Rose, exactly. Not to herself, exactly. To the space between. He's needed it for a long time. The light came through the glass, gray and thin, the specific light of December in London. Neither of them spoke for a while. That evening, after Rose had gone, Margaret asked Mrs. Beale to bring her the letter. She read it again. Properly this time. Not the quick, appalled reading of the first time, but slowly, the way you read something when you're trying to understand it rather than survive it. We have had this planned for some months, as you may remember. She did remember. Constance had mentioned Bath. It had seemed, at the time, like a reasonable future plan. It had not seemed like something that would take precedence over a sick mother. She thought about Constance. She tried to do it honestly, without the softening lens of maternal loyalty, which was difficult, because that lens had been in place for 34 years, and removing it was like trying to see a room without the light you'd always seen it by. Constance had married well. Constance had done everything correctly. She had chosen William Haverford with exactly the clear-headed practicality that Margaret had always said was necessary, and she had built exactly the life that Margaret had always said was possible. And she was in Bath, and a girl from the unfashionable part of the city, the daughter of a music teacher, a woman Margaret had brought tea into her best drawing room in order to discourage. That girl had shown up 3 days in a row with soup and books, and the particular quality of presence that doesn't ask for anything back. Margaret set the letter down. She thought about her mother's drawing room, the conversation she'd had at 22, the boy she'd turned away from. She had never told anyone about him, not Edmund, not Constance, not anyone. She had put it away very thoroughly, the way you put things away when you've decided that examining them serves no useful purpose. She examined it now. He had been kind. He had been funny, which she'd forgotten until this moment. The way you forget the specific sound of someone's laugh until something calls it back. He had not been suitable. She had been so afraid. Not of him. Of what her mother had said. Of the consequences. The isolation. The closed doors. She had sat in that drawing room and been afraid. And she had made the sensible decision. And she had told herself for 40 years that she'd been right. She was still not entirely sure she'd been wrong. The fear had not been imaginary. The doors that closed on unsuitable women were real doors, with real consequences. But she was lying in bed, with a chest cold in December, and the suitable daughter was in Bath, and the unsuitable girl was the one who'd come. There was something in that, something she couldn't quite dismiss. She turned off the lamp. The room went dark. She thought, Edmund is 32 years old. He has spent 32 years being what I needed him to be. She thought his father would have let him have the dog. She lay in the dark for a long time. In the morning, she didn't reach for a plan. He came back on Friday as promised. She heard him in the hall, heard his voice asking Mrs. Beale how she was, heard his footsteps on the stairs. Quick, not running, but with an urgency that he was trying to contain. He appeared in the doorway. He looked. She noticed this with a small and unexpected tenderness. He looked frightened. Under the composed exterior, under the careful Edmund face he wore in the world, he looked like a 7-year-old boy who'd been told something was wrong and had traveled as fast as he could manage. "You look better," he said. "I am better," she said. "Come in. You're letting the cold air in." He came in, sat in the chair by the window, Rose's chair from the past few days, though he didn't know that. He looked at her with the careful attention of someone checking that the thing they'd been afraid of wasn't true. "Rose came," Margaret said. Edmund went still. "Every day," Margaret said. "She brought soup." She sat. A pause. "She told me about the room." Edmund looked at her, uncertain. "The acoustics," Margaret said. "That you measured it." Something moved across his face. Not quite embarrassment, not quite pride. It seemed, "I wanted it to be right." "I know," said Margaret. "I know you did." The room was quiet. "Mother," Edmund began. "Don't," she said. Not harshly, tiredly. "Don't have the argument. I'm too tired for the argument, and I don't think—" She stopped, started more carefully. "I don't think I have the same argument in me anymore." Edmund looked at her for a long moment. "Are you saying—" "I'm saying I'm tired," Margaret said, "and that the soup was very good, and that your father would have liked her, I think. He would have liked that she didn't pretend." She turned to look at the window, the December light, the bare trees at the edge of the garden. "That's all I'm saying," she said. "For now." Edmund didn't speak, but she heard him exhale, a long, slow breath, the kind of breath you take when something you've been carrying for a long time gets, if not put down, then at least shifted to a different shoulder. She hadn't said yes. She hadn't said welcome. She'd said the soup was good, and that his father would have liked her. For Edmund Ashworth, who had spent 32 years translating his mother's silences, that was everything. There's a moment in every long conflict when both sides realize, quietly and without announcement, that the fighting is over. Not because anyone won, not because anyone surrendered, but because something happened that made the original terms of the battle feel very small. For Margaret Ashworth, that moment had come in a dark bedroom in December, with a folded letter on the bedside table, and the memory of a boy she hadn't thought about in 40 years. She didn't tell Edmund any of this. She didn't tell Rose. She didn't tell anyone, because Margaret Ashworth had never in her life been the kind of woman who narrated her own interior transformations. She simply shifted, imperceptibly to most people, perceptibly over the weeks that followed, to the two people watching most closely. She stopped making comments at breakfast. She stopped asking Edmund where he was going with the particular inflection that meant she already knew and disapproved. She stopped scheduling conflicting engagements on the evenings he had plans. Edmund noticed immediately. He didn't say anything, because he had inherited his mother's understanding that some things are too fragile to be spoken aloud before they've had time to become solid. Rose noticed because one afternoon in January, she arrived at Ashworth House. Edmund had asked her to lunch, a small thing, carefully casual, and Margaret passed through the drawing room, nodded at her, and said, "Miss Calloway," in a tone that contained, for the first time, nothing pointed. Just her name. Just that. Rose said, "Your Grace," and Margaret moved on, and Edmund watched from across the room with the expression of a man witnessing something he'd stopped believing was possible. It wasn't warmth. Not yet. Warmth would take longer, would take, in fact, the better part of a year, and would arrive not in a single moment but in accumulations. A question asked and genuinely listened to, a meal shared without performance, an afternoon in the garden where Margaret showed Rose the roses her husband had planted 30 years ago and said, without quite looking at her, that they needed someone who understood them. But the ceasefire was real, and in a battle that had been about control for 30 years, a ceasefire was extraordinary. The moment that finished it, really finished it, the last locked room in Margaret, came in March. Edmund had been ill, nothing serious. 3 days of fever and misery, and the specific indignity of being unwell in your own house, while trying to maintain the appearance of a man who is managing perfectly. Rose had been in and out, which Margaret had by this point stopped actively resisting. She'd even once brought tea upstairs herself without being asked, set it on Edmund's bedside table, and left without comment. On the 4th day, Edmund was better. Rose arrived in the afternoon. Edmund was downstairs in the music room, a room he'd opened up more since the evening of the small concert, as if he'd rediscovered it. Margaret was in the hall when she heard it. Edmund, at the piano. She knew his playing. He'd had lessons as a child, had stopped when he was 12, had occasionally returned to it in private moments ever since. He was not a performer. He'd never wanted to be watched. And then Rose's violin, not a piece, not something rehearsed. The kind of playing that happens when two people are simply in the same room with their instruments and time, and one begins something, and the other finds it. She'd heard this described, but never understood it. The way music between two people who trust each other has a quality that music between two strangers never quite reaches. Something unhurried, something that doesn't need to arrive anywhere. She stood in the hall and listened. She thought about Robert, her husband, Edmund's father. He had played the piano badly and enthusiastically, and with great happiness, and she had sat in that same room 30 years ago and listened and thought, this is enough. Whatever else the world is, this is enough. She had forgotten that. She had been so busy protecting Edmund from the wrong life that she had forgotten to show him what the right one felt like. He seemed to have found it anyway. She stood in the hall for a long time. She didn't go in. That room was not hers right now. But she stood there, and she listened. And somewhere in the space between one breath and the next, the last thing she'd been holding, the last rigid, frightened, 40-year-old conviction that love needed to look a certain way to be real, let go. It didn't make a sound. These things never do. She went to the kitchen, told Mrs. Beale they would be 3 for dinner, and began. Slowly, privately, in the way she did all important things, to figure out how to say welcome to someone without ever quite having to say the word. That's where we'll leave them. Not at a wedding, not at a grand gesture, not at a scene where every feeling is named and resolved and tied with something neat. Because real life doesn't do that. Real life gives you a woman standing in a hallway, listening to her son play piano with someone she'd tried to send away. Real life gives you a ceasefire that nobody announces, a warmth that arrives in small installments, a dinner for 3 that becomes, over time, simply the way things are. Edmund and Rose were married the following autumn. A small ceremony, her idea, and he agreed immediately, which Margaret noted and chose not to comment on. Margaret sat in the front row in a gray dress and held her hands in her lap. And when Edmund looked at her from the altar, she gave him a nod that contained, if you knew her, everything. She was not, even then, a woman who cried in public. But afterward, when the guests had moved to the garden, and Edmund was somewhere with Rose, and the light was doing something particular through the windows of Ashworth House, Mrs. Beale found her in the hall and asked if she needed anything, and Margaret said, "No, thank you, Beale. I'm quite all right." And she was. For the first time in a long time, not because everything had gone as planned, not because she'd won, but because she was standing in her house listening to laughter in the garden, and none of it had gone as planned, and all of it was real. She was quite all right. Edmund and Rose had 2 children, a girl and a boy, in that order, which Edmund privately considered the correct order, though he never said why. Rose continued to play, not out of financial necessity after the marriage, but because she had never been the kind of woman who gave up the thing that was most hers, and Edmund had never, not for a single moment, suggested she should. She taught as well. She opened a small music school in the east of the city, the kind of neighborhood she'd grown up in, and she ran it with the same practical warmth she brought to everything. Edmund was on the board. He handled the lease negotiations and attended every student concert, including the ones featuring children who were not yet, charitably speaking, ready for an audience. Margaret lived at Ashworth House until she died, in 1894, at 71. She and Rose never became easy with each other, in the way of women who have always been friends. There was always, between them, the memory of what had been said in that drawing room, over untouched sandwiches, and the scar of it, though healed, remained. But they became something more interesting than easy. They became honest. Margaret told Rose things she told no one else, about Robert, about the boy she hadn't married, about the fear that had run the whole machinery of her life for 40 years. Rose listened, and didn't offer comfort that wasn't true, and made tea, and stayed. At Margaret's funeral, Edmund spoke briefly and well. Rose sat in the front row with their daughter on her lap, and when it was over and the guests had gone and the house was quiet, she went to the music room, took out her violin, and played the piece her father had written, and she had finished. The one she'd played the night Edmund had first asked her what the music was. She played it for Margaret, who had been, in the end, the most complicated person she'd ever loved. Thank you for spending this time with Edmund, and Rose, and Margaret Ashworth. If this story stayed with you, the complicated love, the locked doors, the people who come through anyway, I'd love to know which moment got you most. Leave it in the comments. I read every single one. And don't forget to tell us which city you're watching from. And if you're new here, welcome. There's more where this came from.